Well, welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Rafael Fonseca. I'm a hematologist at the Mayo Clinic, and we're going to start this series of video clips to talk a little bit about the process of innovation in medicine, particularly as it relates to drugs and devices. And it's my pleasure to have with me today Bruce Gingles. Bruce has been with Cook Medical now for 40 years, and he's vice president for technology assessment and health policy. And Bruce and I have known about each other now for quite some time, mostly in the electronic format, not in person. So welcome to the show. It's a pleasure having you here, and we're both, discussing before we start this, of course, what are some of our goals, and would like to, be this sort of an instrument of dissemination of the value of innovation, talk about the process, talk about policy, etc. So welcome, and thank you for taking the time to be here.
Thank you, Dr. Fonseca. It's so nice to be with you today.
Yeah, finally we get to meet each other. We're email buddies, and it probably goes now back a few years that we started the conversation, and it's never stopped.
Well, I've certainly felt like I've known you as a friend, even though, like you said, it's our first meeting in person.
Isn't that remarkable? Sometimes, it's happened to me with other venues with social media that, you start interacting with someone else, and suddenly you realize there's so much value in this human aspect of someone who has either a different perspective or can complement some of what you're saying, and there's just tremendous growth in that.
Well, it's so nice to have a chance to explore this a little bit.
So, well, thank you. And as you and I talked, we're exploring this idea of doing it through video. I've been told that video is one of the ways in which actually, the message will be best conveyed in the future. So let's give that a try and see what the response is.
Oh, very good.
Can maybe, just to make it a little bit more familiar, can I start by maybe asking if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about yourself and, how did you get into the device industry, which is, by the way, new to me because I've been working mostly with pharmaceutical companies, not as much with device companies.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear a little bit about you.
Well, I was an enthusiastic but mediocre biology major at Indiana University in the mid and late 70s, and I had no prospects. And but I was working part-time at a men's store, and one of my customers was an executive at this small family-owned business in Bloomington, Indiana. He took an interest in my career and offered to host me for a tour of their facility. And he told me the business was catheters, and I wasn't very interested. Catheters, I said, this doesn't sound too exciting. But once I became familiar with the cardiovascular side and all the applications beyond my imagination of catheters, and with the opportunity that he presented, that was the beginning of my career.
Wow, it just goes to show that you can meet someone who's going to be so important the rest of your life, in the most unexpected places, right? So that is fascinating. So you and I were talking a little bit about the process of, the device approval, the process of innovation, how devices, really have changed how we practice medicine, and then how there's still some very significant gaps in what people do. Just for background, for those in the audience who may not know as much about devices, can you tell me a little bit, how is that similar and how is that different from the process of drug approval, and who do you rely on making the right decisions along those steps?
Yes, well, it's a very important point. So the primary difference between drug approval and device approval is that all drugs go through a single pathway at the Food and Drug Administration, a new drug application, NDA. Medical devices has two pathways. We have the pre-market notification, commonly known as the 510K system, and we have the pre-market approval, or PMA system, which requires rigorous clinical trials to prove safety and efficacy. The 510K system relies on this principle of substantial equivalence to a legally marketed predicate device. So if you can show similarity to a device that's already on the market and is functioning well, then you can avoid the requirement of a clinical trial. And in fact, that system of allowing the incremental improvements to be launched to the market without lengthy and expensive clinical trials, and the vast majority of those have had excellent safety records, good performance profiles. Having those two pathways, so for high-risk devices, those whose failure would represent serious risk to the patient, those are always placed in the pre-market approval, PMA pathway, and a clinical trial is required. But for those that are medium and low risk, or that are just incredibly incremental, in those low and medium risk devices,
Sure.
they can qualify for market authorization through the 510K system.
So is it fair to say you think there's a little bit of more leeway on flexibility when it comes down to devices versus drugs? I'm just thinking through the process because there's probably some incremental improvements in devices, like perhaps a slightly different design for the scalpel blade.
Yes.
That maybe we can all agree is probably not something that deserves as much scrutiny as, say, something that levitates and is causing blood to flow through the heart of a person.
Yes, this is exactly right. So there was a strong desire by the government not to penalize the incremental improvement. So one of the distinctions between drugs and devices is that drugs often have side effects.
Mm-hmm.
Devices almost never have side effects. Mm. They're associated often with complications, and the complications can be quite severe. However, the complications tend to be almost always located at the point of the use of the device, almost never systemically, with the exception of infections, device-related infections, some of those sorts of things. But exempting infections, problems that occur with devices are almost always identified in the physical area of the device, whereas a drug can have effects far beyond because of its systemic administration on the physiology in ways that are much more difficult to predict than the mechanical properties of a device.
That's fascinating. And of course, you interface with drugs as well, too, because you have drug-eluting stents and, antimicrobials applied to catheters and the like. So there's a little bit of a gray border there.
Yes, that's right. So we have a market-leading central venous catheter that's coated with antibiotics. And when that product went to market in 1990, no clinical trial was required. It was treated by FDA as a drug, and the antibiotics were secondary to the function of the device. Today, if we tried to put that same product on the market, it's very likely that would require a drug study.
Sure. Well, let me ask you something. You alluded to this whole concept of innovation and incremental innovation, and sometimes I think there's some confusion between what's sort of a transformative new concept or a transformative new device. And occasionally, if you read out the medical literature, people see that a little bit. Well, those are the important things. The incremental ones, those are Me Too's. Those are just mild changes over what we have. But I think there's a very strong argument that those small steps really get us moving forward. And how do we reconcile those postures? Because, and particularly in medical, journals, there's this concept of only things that are totally novel are really worthwhile. And I disagree with that. I'm sure you do as well.
Yeah, I think history would say that if we take both drugs and devices that are in popular use today, and if we retrace their origins, the germ of many of today's most popular technologies is almost unrecognizable from the products that are popular.
Sure.
So penicillins, which were a major breakthrough in their time, have evolved. The beta-lactam family of antibiotics went through cephalosporins and on through generations. Penicillin G and penicillin V, the early drugs,
sure,
they're used very rarely today.
Sure.
But their progeny are still saving lives around the world.
I'm going to date myself, but when I was in training, we were talking about how to use penicillin G and V, the benzathinic, right? But the G, if you had a strep throat, I mean, if you were a child in those days, that was horrific because you needed 10 shots of penicillin G to, get the job done, which was just a terrible thing.
Well, that's right. And later, when beta-lactamase inhibitors were added,
sure,
and the analogs expanded to have broader coverage, these broad spectrum, and so it's not just devices. Of course, the device industry is famous for incremental improvement, but over time, whole new indications come in, and both the function, I'd say in particular, the function greatly expands over time for many, many, many devices.
We have multiple examples like that with drugs as well. So drugs that are just very slightly modified, but maybe they change the toxicity. Sometimes drugs that, in my case, we used to use thalidomide a lot, the infamous thalidomide, of course, with all the birth defects and problems that occurred in the late 1950s. But then the second generation came actually to be quite handy, just because for most patients it doesn't cause neuropathy. So there's a huge difference for patients. Also, combining medications sometimes, just the convenience of having two medications be combined in one tablet just could improve overall survival because people would take the pill. So this whole thing with, efficacy and effectiveness, right? And,
Yes.
and so I think there's multiple examples where that is applied, and I think we should celebrate that probably as much as sort of the whole new idea of CRISPR, etc.
Well, think about short-acting drugs versus long-acting drugs.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe each has a role to play.
Mm-hmm.
And look at all the analogs. The acyclovir, which was such an important breakthrough for viral therapy, but now look at the number of effective drugs in that family that have come to market that treat all sorts of viruses. That
it's just absolutely incredible, the
Yeah.
progress that has occurred there. And let me ask you something. One of the things that is less clear to me, again, as someone who's worked more with pharma, what are the issues regarding intellectual property protection and patents and devices? I mean, my amateur eyes tell me it's probably a lot harder because small modifications can probably, quote unquote, show a new concept. And how do you deal with that in your industry?
It's a very good question, and I'm not sure we have a perfect way of dealing with it. The patent law is the same for drugs and devices, that for any invention, a patent has to meet the same three requirements: novelty, utility, and it has to be non-obvious.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as your solution to a problem meets those criteria, then you can earn a U.S. patent. And that applies equally to drugs and devices. One of the differences from a practical standpoint with devices, because very few of our products go through clinical trials prior to going to market, our patent life tends to be much longer. Because we're not eating up all these years in phase 1, 2, 2B, phase 3 trials. Even PMA devices that do require clinical trials are usually done in a single phase and often are much smaller, almost always much smaller trials than would be typical for drugs. So the residual life of a device patent tends to be reasonably longer.
I've never thought of that before, but my reaction to that would be, as someone who's, supportive for free market principles, of course, that enhances competition because the time to approval is shorter. Does that hold true? How things play out in the market, or not?
It's an interesting dynamic because there's a slope that the cost to the resource consumption to bring a new technology, drug or device to market. If it's easy to bring to market, you don't have to worry if the impact is too big. If it's inexpensive and quick, then even if there's only a small patient population that benefits, it can be affordable. But if it takes years, if it takes decades in some cases, and billions of dollars, now to recover that, you really need a major impact. You need a Lipitor
of course.
or Plavix. And in devices, because the improvements to devices, again, tend to be sort of sequential and often relatively minor, the cost to develop those improvements is often much less. So the device industry can take chances. The cost of failure is usually much lower. And so if we make a simple modification, 5 years later it's not commercially popular, we're typically not out much in terms of time and money. Whereas that's not a possibility for the development of most drugs.
But I'm thinking, and you deal with a series of customers that people are going to buy your products, right? But ultimately, it's both the physicians and the patients who are right there at the front of the whole process.
Yes.
And obviously, reputation and brand are critical. So if you're going to have a pacemaker installed and you're the surgeon who's doing that, let's say someone in private practice, you want to make sure your patients know that pacemaker is quite reliable, right? So, or the leads that come out of that pacemaker, whatever you're using, really has a reliability, and part of that always falls back on reputation and brand.
Yeah, that's right. So a pacemaker is always a class 3 device and always would require a clinical trial to gain approval to the market. But the manufacturer's own standards for quality and performance often exceed those of the regulators. Mm-hmm. So the regulatory standard is the basement, that's the floor, but doesn't really address the ceiling. And so there's great incentive for manufacturers to build as much functionality and quality into the product to create what you're talking about, this brand of reliability, this brand of high performance. The time and money that go into bringing products to market is so high today that any failure can be catastrophic.
Sure.
To the platform. So the inventing physician, the manufacturer that invests in the technology, they're so focused, particularly in the early stages of adoption, where one failure in the first 50 patients could totally derail years of work.
Sure.
Once products have been in the market for years and years, and thousands and even tens of thousands have been used, if there happens to be a product failure, it may relate to failure of the product itself, or it could be a skill issue on the side of the operator. Could be an environmental issue. Sometimes these work in the context of complex systems. It's not necessarily just one device. Then the device, late in its life cycle, is less on trial than its early launch phases, where all the attention is on the new thing.
Fascinating. For those of us who are not in the field, is it fair to say most, perhaps only the simplest ones don't have, but most devices have a number of patents. There must be different components to each one of the devices, and maybe take that to an extreme, the defibrillator, that's probably hundreds, if not thousands of patents, I would imagine.
Yes, often dozens, or even, like I said, even hundreds.
Yeah.
Complex products, things like anesthesia machines, almost everything in the Department of Radiology, CT scanners,
sure,
plain film X-ray, MRI, all the way from very basic scientific patents up to very practical and engineering patents.
Fascinating. What do you think meaning the physicians that deal with pharma, should know more about, devices that we don't normally think about? You've alluded to a few of those things already, and alluded to the process, etc. But it seems to me there's a number of very significant differences in how we approach.
Well, to me, the most important is the intimate association of the physician to the device. Virtually all successful devices in the market today were conceived and first validated by an imaginative physician. And industry was only there to make tangible the concept that's imagined by that inventor. Whereas in drugs, we have many, many, many drugs today that were conceived in the drug laboratory, not in the hospital, not in the clinic. The clinical trials were done by physicians in the clinic, but the compounding, working out of the molecular structure, the rapid throughput screening today, some of these are done almost entirely in the domain of the manufacturer itself. So the role of the physician inventor in the drug world today is much smaller, I would argue, than for devices.
Interesting. It's kind of this triangular relationship where there's, medicinal chemistry or basic labs. They think about the concept, they think about the drug, they develop that, goes to development, then goes to the patient, whereas here is more circular in the way that, using the example of the surgeon, they're driving that cycle of innovation.
Well, that's right. And in fact, one example of the intimate relationship of physicians to the devices is the popular devices are actually named after the inventor, the Swan-Ganz catheter, or the Fogarty catheter, or the Foley catheter, where in the drug world we have Plavix and Lipitor and words that don't mean anything to anybody.
Yes,
we don't see an inventor's name on associated with drugs the way we do so commonly with devices.
I should throw at you some of the names of the most recently approved drugs, which are the one of the greatest challenges to any mind. There's this things called the CAR T cells. Here goes the name of one of them is Tisagen Leclusel.
Yeah, right.
That's almost like a foreign language term, right? Which means nothing to anyone. But
unpronounceable.
Yes.
And in our world, this would harm the brand because you cannot ask someone on the supply side, please make sure we have enough of these.
Speaking of the Fogarty catheter, I think there was some time where you interacted with a company too as well, right? Or with Dr. Fogarty?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, we enjoyed a very nice relationship. We went on tour, three of us, talking to departments of surgery about the role of surgeons and the vital role of surgeons in developing new technologies for clinical problems that still today have no practical solution. And Dr. Fogarty is a brilliant inventor, charismatic speaker, articulate in every way, and really just a tremendous champion for the role of the surgeon innovator.
That is fantastic. And I've gotten to know other people like Dr. Heimlich, who unfortunately has since passed away.
Yes.
But those names always stick with you.
Well, and Dr. Fogarty is alive, and he's very active with the Fogarty Institute for Innovation at El Camino Hospital in Mountain View, just down the road from Stanford University, where he spent
right there in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, where he spent so much of his career
Sure.
at Stanford. Yeah.
One of the things that we face with drugs, and I think you face with devices too as well, is this whole thing with off-label promotion. Yes. And ultimately off-label utilization of some of the products. I think some of the companies have recently actually challenged that against the FDA successfully. But I mean, that's even a bigger deal sometimes with devices. It's like, are you allowed to cut in a certain way? Again, simplifying it to a scalpel, or to what extent that really recognizes the complexity of what medicine is or what surgery is, that it's not really a linear path. And I think that's often misunderstood.
Well, yeah, this is a very problematic area, and I don't think our society and our regulatory groups, industry, and the profession have quite figured out the proper chemistry for this. So there have been three important challenges, two on the drug side. One was Amarin Pharmaceuticals. The second I'm blanking on. One on the device side, which was Vascular Solutions. And in each case, the company was, or their representatives were prosecuted for promoting products off-label. The companies chose to defend themselves in court, and in each of those three cases, the charge against the company was overturned, and they prevailed in court. So now the precedents on the backs of these three important cases have caused policymakers, including those at the federal level, to question what degree of autonomy should manufacturers and providers have, professionals, in sharing information about potential uses of products beyond the labeled indication.
This is nuanced, but I think we can all agree that you want to make sure there's some safeguards so the wrong things are not done. Then at the same time, I think I would argue, and some others would argue, well, based on this brand and reputation we're talking about, you want to make sure that your products stand the test of time. And what better way is there for that to happen by them being used in the best possible, the use that we have in medicine.
Yes, that's right. It's important, I think, that, of course, evidence-based medicine is one of the great inventions of the modern era and is responsible for enormous health gains. Unfortunately, it's not plausible that we'll have high-quality clinical trials for more than a tiny fraction of the questions involving the use of technology, because of complex patient populations, because of potentially broad utilities. Clinicians today make hundreds of decisions a day on behalf of patients, and asking for each of those decisions to be the subject of a large randomized clinical trial in order for that clinician to make that decision is probably not a practical proposal. So one of the questions will be for our society, how much judgment do we trust physicians to exert on behalf of their patient? Does professional judgment still have a role in an era where there's greater and greater expectations for an evidence basis for decision making? But again, in reality, the idea that a currently conducted, properly designed, highly powered study for each and every decision that has to be made with all the confounding variables that apply to each of these patients, diets, age, comorbidities, genetic factors. And so to try to enroll all these into tightly defined trials is probably beyond the scope of today's resources.
It's mathematically impossible. I just did the math with the drugs that are available for the disease I deal with, myeloma. And then if you bring in stratifying variables such as biology, age, comorbidities, it just becomes literally impossible, which the same would be true for devices. So I recently did a write-up that I made a comparison to that very famous poem by the Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges, which talks about a cartographer. This cartographer is tasked with developing the most precise map of the city, and as he goes on, there's a greater demand for more and more detail, to the point that the map becomes indistinguishable from reality.
Yes.
And then you didn't know if you were in the map or if you were in reality.
Yes.
Well, that obviously is just a depiction of what would happen even if we had the resources, of what we would have to do to reproduce every single scenario that occurs in medicine. Now, I myself will stand and say, of course, we recognize the value of the best data that can be generated through phase 3 trials, but even then, it becomes restricted to a population that was, enrolled in that particular trial. And generalizing those findings to other populations is the same as what you're doing with the decision making through your professional opinion.
So, in the simplest example, in the device world, let's take the case of a hypodermic needle, which could be used to access a blood vessel and draw a blood sample, or to check blood pressure, but also could be used to inject a drug in the muscle or the subcutaneous tissue. And because the needle has a simple function and a simple design, is it reasonable to require that hypodermic needles go through large randomized trial for each penetration of tissue to different levels? So you can, and that's at the most basic level, but as devices increase in complexity and risk, then at some point reasonable people have to decide then what is a reasonable standard to assure safety and effectiveness of the product.
Sure. I'll say I'm not, I can't claim to fully understand the writings, but I'm a fan of Taleb when he writes about the whole process of, the value of the empirical process and nature in this world.
Yes.
So he makes this comparison between the Greek and the Roman, the Greek being, if you made more hypothesis-driven, more EBM, whereas the Romans are, more practical, and, arguably they ended up having a greater degree of influence over time. And I think we see that tension in medicine often, and it's not to say, of course, everyone loves the Greek style, but until we get to that future, and if we get to that future, probably never, we have to acknowledge all of these nuances of the day-to-day empiricism.
Well, and the brand of American medicine might say that the internist is evolved of the Greek, and the surgeon is evolved of the Roman.
I love that analogy. It's true, and being an internist myself, I'd like to say that is true, and somehow we need to find that way to communicate. I do find that the surgeons tend to have a little bit more of a practical understanding of that real world. I mean, internists, we sometimes are criticized as, trying to do therapy through note writing. Of course, that's not ever the intent, but the reality is there's at least a perceived good grasp of that practical utility by our surgical colleagues.
Well, and I think what you touch on is this issue of errors of commission and errors of omission.
Mm-hmm.
And when we recognize that the use of new technology, drugs or devices, have the potential to not only help people but also cause serious harm, then a natural reaction is to make sure that we don't have errors of commission, that we avoid the use of these products in any situation that could lead to an adverse event. But if we become so afraid that a mistake or a complication can occur, then we'll simply avoid performing these procedures, and now we suffer deprivation.
Mm-hmm.
And now errors of omission dominate errors of commission, and we fail to treat patients that are desperately in need of some risk-taking, because the risk-benefit ratio favors an intervention, even if less than 100% are successful.
Yeah. And this is absolutely a key point. I think it's often underappreciated. So I always say, tongue-in-cheek, I never signed this whole thing of first do no harm, which somehow we're all supposed to abide by. And of course, who's going to say I'm going to do harm? It's first do no harm. But should there be a balance there? And talking to some of my colleagues here, as we were saying, maybe it should be above all help. And help is that balance between doing the right thing and not doing harm. Because I think take the first do no harm to an extreme will just really bias you towards this idea of omission, and you're not going to do things. And as you know, in medicine, we have the sort of early adopters and those that are very conservative. And if you really sit completely on this very conservative, there just needs to be an acknowledgement you're going to miss out on things that you could be doing now, but you're not, just because you don't have that certainty that would be as comfortable as the ones that are here.
So the proud tradition of do no harm comes into tension with another very popular mantra, the Good Samaritan.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we inhibit the Good Samaritan from doing what almost everyone in society fully expects them to do, stop and help the afflicted,
sure,
even with some risk that the outcome may not be 100% perfect, what is that threshold of success that we'll rely on, that will...
So let me probe a little bit more and expand on that, on what you're saying. How it seems to me, I'm just going to throw out a hypothesis, it seems to me that, in our medical training and through the process of medical school, we kind of touch on the subjects, but we don't really grasp the importance of their meaning. So that, we maybe have a course in ethics and there's some discussion about, these principles we're talking about, but then once you're out in the field, you realize this is your day-to-day operations. And, how do we bring that, not that knowledge, but that awareness, and particularly awareness of the importance of all of this and how we conduct ourselves, in the clinic?
Well, it's a very difficult question, and I don't claim to know the answer, but this transition from the learner to the expert is on so many people's minds. Academicians who are charged to prepare these minds and these skills of the learners so that when they're really fully ready to accept the responsibility of a practice, that their skills reflect well on their institution, on the system overall, because society has invested so much in creating this large healthcare system and a very successful healthcare system. At the same time, once people get out in the real world, and particularly those that have autonomy to learn in their practices, grow, take the challenges, the very carefully considered challenges, and as their skills develop patient by patient by patient, and before too long it's been hundreds, many now can claim thousands of patients that they have consulted or treated, there is this element, I think, that is inescapable of the judgment that develops in the really deeply experienced health professional, and that transcends all of the academic preparation that goes into this career. So someone who's had an active, successful practice for 10, 15, 20 years or even longer, that accumulated knowledge simply, there's just no way, I think, to build that, regardless of how good your training systems are, as long as they remain in the cocoon in the medical school.
Sure.
It's this variety, this diversity, this change of circumstances. And each of those lessons from each patient is packed away somewhere in the mind and then presents itself at unpredicted future episodes where I remember facing this some years ago and I learned a valuable lesson and now I can apply it to this next patient.
Of course. People sometimes are critical of that part, but in the sense that they're saying, well, sometimes there's old practices and there's new standards. I understand that part. But then at the same time, there's this I'm going to call it imponderable wisdom that comes from that experience. And that wisdom, of course, leads to the observation that then drives the future clinical trials and the future development of devices. So it's really a nuanced process. And I think it's often underappreciated how important that is. In my field of oncology, I feel like my medical know-how sometimes is only a small part of that encounter. An oncologist is in a large part, someone who's a counselor, can serve as a psychologist, can serve as someone who supports and guides and orients patients as they come to the decisions of what's best for their treatment. Sometimes walking into a room, I know what the medical decision-making process is only in about 2 minutes.
Yes.
That's not always the case. Sometimes it's more complex, but there's a whole human interaction, and that you only learn with experience.
Yeah, I think that judgment always goes beyond just the familiarity with technology and conformance to a guideline. So there's dozens and dozens of guidelines that affect almost every specialty today.
Mm-hmm.
The professional that adheres to every element of the guideline and knows how to operate each piece of new equipment skillfully, still, I think, those alone don't represent the state of the art for the health professional today. It's only when you combine those with this deeply ingrained judgment that's come from years of experience.
Sure.
Empiricism in some cases.
I'm sure you see that a lot more of that too, because you can first kind of witness that in surgery. So some surgeons would be far more comfortable if a very specific peer of them, perform the surgery. I'm sure that becomes hard to as well as one ages. I'm sure there's a few surgeons that people start thinking, does that person still have the skills or the steady hand?
That's right.
And I'm not one to criticize steady hand, so I have essential tremors, so I won't ever say that's a requisite to be a good doctor. But in fact, I mean, there are going to be some limitations that could put surgeons in a bad spot.
Well, and as you say, it's so nuanced, and hopefully we never have to make a decision where it's only going to be either the adherence to guidelines and technical familiarity versus judgment and empiricism. Hopefully there's an aggregation.
I think that's precisely the point. It's very, very nuanced. It's not a one simple solution or a one simple explanation for all of what we see in medicine. So let me expand. You touched on guidelines, and there's a presumption often that guidelines drive best therapy, and that presumption assumes that there's such homogeneity in a given patient population. So we create taxonomy. Okay, these are the patients who have such and such condition, let's say vascular, who have an aneurysm of the aorta that is more than 3 centimeters beyond whatever, but I'm sure if you ask surgeons, they're going to tell you each one of those patients is different.
Yes.
So the idea of applying guidelines in a very strict way to individual cases becomes very problematic. And I think we can all say, well, if you're gonna do X surgery, the patient needs prophylaxis for thrombosis. Everyone can agree on that. Even then, they'll find exceptions. But then using those guidelines to very rigidly guide practice, I think in anyone's mind it would be problematic if you have this experience.
Well, not only considering the wide variability, but I think some real humility toward guidelines is warranted, because look at all the guidelines that were endorsed by every important body, only later, a few years later, to be overturned or to be discredited. And we've gone from things like ultra-tight glucose control,
sure,
diabetic patients, to more laissez-faire approaches. And yet, at publication, people are so convinced that this guideline is the truth.
Sure.
And what do we see 5 and 10 years later for so many? I mean, of course, many guidelines have long legs. They're still with us and have served medicine and patients very well. But we don't always know which will endure and which ones.
Some of them, as trials come forward, additional information comes forward, they're reversed, and that's obviously very important. It's unfortunate, of course, that you lose what you thought was good, but it's obviously the truth. It's important that the bad practice goes away, so that
Yes.
stands to reason. Speaking a little bit about guidelines and familiarity with the devices, a few years ago, I think you and I first became engaged when we were talking about some of the problems we were seeing with conflict of interest.
Yes.
And I do remember interacting with individuals who would assist during surgery, like with spine surgery. They would go into the operating room and they knew precisely what screw you needed, what plate you needed, much better than any assistant, a surgeon could have just from their hospital, because they knew all the details about that equipment. Can you expand a little bit on that knowledge and familiarity that someone like that has with the product, and then how that helps, a surgeon or someone who's doing an interventional procedure in achieving optimal outcomes?
Well, I have to freely admit from the beginning that I'm deeply conflicted on the subject of conflicts.
Sure.
So I work in the for-profit industry, and our company and our industry has an incentive to sustain the enterprise. And one of the ways we do that is to keep the business on solid footing. But with that disclosure made, it's quite a concern for me today to watch a system in which people are we've lost this idea of presumption of innocence.
Mm-hmm.
That people are presumed guilty on the weakest of all bases, and that's what I call the standard of perception or appearance. There's no objectivity to this, and there's always someone that can object to someone on this basis of appearance. And we've become quite punitive as a society toward people who are actually doing very fine work, but because someone objects to the appearance of an impropriety when in many cases none exists, I think we're losing a great deal of talent. We're losing a great deal of performance. I hope that we'll be collectively very careful about how we discipline people for working, in most cases, entirely in the interest of their patients. And yet, because they are balancing many, many interests, it's not just altruism versus money,
Sure.
but hundreds of interests at one time, and almost always very successfully in terms of the outcome of the patient. And yet, because of the possibility that a payment could influence a judgment, we have, I think, maybe gone too far
Mm-hmm.
in the regulation of physicians that have certain conflicts.
You know, I think this relationships, it can be argued they've helped tremendously as we advance the agenda because of this bidirectional relationship that exists between physicians and device makers and pharmaceuticals, myself included. You know, I'll put that certainly at the beginning of our video, my personal relationships, which I've always valued because I have seen firsthand how we, in collaboration with the private sector, we have improved tremendously the survival of myeloma patients. And to say that could have only happened because of the academic sector would be, hubris. We don't really have the tools to make that happen, but it's because of this partnership that things have moved forward. So I'm worried. I think there is a potential that maybe we did too little, too late. I mean, I wonder if there's people out there, this whole thing with the seen on the unseen, right?
Yes.
I wonder if there's people out there who maybe at some point in their career, particularly young individuals, thought, maybe I'm not going to pursue this, but now not anymore because, maybe this is going to cast me in a bad light or something detrimental to my professional development that I think maybe it's just something I should avoid.
Well, 20 or 25 years ago in the prestigious academic medical centers, inventors, innovators, they were the pride of the institution. Mm-hmm. They were sort of local heroes, and they were accorded a certain respect, both by their peers, but by credentialing bodies, by editors, etc., for the impact of their inventions on populations of patients far beyond those that they could treat personally. Mm-hmm. Today, I think those very same activities of inventing and patenting, royalty-bearing technologies, they become pariahs. They become demonized in a way that their professional standing in many circles has been challenged. And yet, the impact of both groups, those that invented years ago, those that are still attempting to invent today, is the same. They're finding better solutions to problems. They're coming up with novel technologies that wouldn't exist without this creative thinking, without the resources of investors and manufacturers and things to bring these to the market. But I think if we discourage, not only from a regulatory standpoint, but once we convince people that this hard work is not worthy, that it's unprofessional in some people's words, this becomes very discouraging to people who have really chosen as a career a path that really helps them improve the care of patients. And if your own colleague looks at you and says, I think you're unprofessional for working with these companies where there may be a financial relationship, that can be so discouraging that, as you say, they may choose not to pursue this at all. And then where will we be? Where will these ideas come from? They certainly won't come from manufacturers like in the device industry. Whether some of them come from drugs, I can't say.
And, it is disheartening and it is sad, and in the sense that I always argue that, and this is not self-serving because I'm an immigrant to this country, but the world depends on this cauldron of innovation that is the U.S.
Yes.
And it's all environment dependent. And this environment has been not only permissive but celebratory in the past.
Yes.
If you work for a company and you came up with a new device, you were a hero, and that has changed, of course. So now the light is cast in a different way as to if you work with industry, maybe you're suspect and you're impure, and maybe, as you said, in some people's eyes you would be unprofessional. And the literature very clearly shows that the bulk of new compounds come from the United States.
Yes.
And in fact, foreign companies who want to recoup their investments in R&D do so thinking that they can start with that revenue coming from the U.S.
Yes.
So if you're a small company in Norway, you're not going to get your revenue from Norway. You'll get it from our market. Now, I always argue we shouldn't care. We have early access. We pay more, but we have access to new medications, and then that's sort of a backside of this, which I always find as a positive thing to say, is that our European colleagues pay a lot less, for instance, for medications, but usually that comes with later access, because they really get a discount because they run some of the best clinical trials. And why so? Because that's a way in which they can have access to some of these novel medications as they are being approved in our countries.
Yes.
So that's something that really I hope it doesn't completely change, because we have the whole environment for innovation. And I've heard someone say before, the one advantage the U.S. has is that we have the tolerance for failure.
Mm.
So if you set up a company and you fail, you don't really care. You don't become ostracized and are sent out to a mountain. You roll up your sleeves, and if you can get the money again, you try one more time. And it is that standing up again that really has driven the entrepreneurship that drives the American system.
My own company, our founder, Bill Cook, and our company is now 55 years old, and we're successful today, but we were his third company. His first two failed. But I think the point you raise is very important. We've somehow simplified this to motive of altruism on one hand and capitalism on another. And we're trying to decide whether altruism and capitalism are compatible. But in fact, I think the nuances that you described are so much richer than just these two simple themes. And until we can begin to think about the processes that go into conceiving and validating, commercializing technologies far beyond a motive of altruism or capitalistic gain, then if we can't look a little further, I don't think we'll get far.
Yeah, and I do believe, and I think the majority of people who are opposed to this, particularly when it comes down to free market and capitalism, approach that with good intentions. But obviously, someone has said the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yes.
Right? So we have to look at outcomes, and the outcomes are really what matters. And when it all comes down to it, it is a system that is coming out of this, albeit imperfect, capitalistic structure that we have here, that is driving that innovation.
Yeah.
And I follow one website called humanprogress.org that comes out of the Cato Institute, and they're putting out daily what are some of the things that are very clear, demonstrable, pieces of evidence that we're doing better. And that in large part comes from this idea that humans are better off if they have the capacity to do this free exchange and engage in freely in this relationships, which is really the core of capitalism. That's not to say that there shouldn't be any regulation, so I'm not in any way an anarchist, so to speak. Yeah. But we need to come to terms that there is there are some gains that come out of the system. I do find that notion incredibly rare in academic medicine.
Yeah, hopefully we'll be able to preserve this idea of risk and benefit as a common theme, that it can never be only about risk or only about benefit.
Sure.
But they exist in some tension, and that balance between the two, which certainly takes delicate judgment.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you and I were talking before is as this innovation moves forward, sometimes the innovation will be expensive. And why is it expensive? Well, it provides value, and it required quite a bit of investment to get us there. I think this is clearly the case with drugs, that there is going to be that period of patent exclusivity where there needs to be the revenue that substantiates the existence of this innovation that comes with pharmaceutical companies. But in time, things change, and those are the generics of the future. And absent that, today's best is as good as it gets, right? Unless there's other mechanisms that we could postulate. And I think there's other ideas that people have, but until we have some track record of them being effective, it is quite risky to try to stop this.
Yeah, so this is the world really of the economist, I'd say. Maybe we can think of economics as the study of choices and their consequences. And so when individuals or groups of people make choices to invest in a new technology, a new drug, they're committing enormous time and resources to conform to the standards in a highly regulated world.
Mm-hmm.
So they're putting at huge risk years of work. A 55-year-old that invents a drug today will never live to see the use of that drug in a patient, or at least won't be practicing to see that. That's for their children or maybe their grandchildren.
That doesn't leave me a lot of time.
That's right. But I think, this is the challenge is, we put a lot of this on regulation, and that does drive a lot of the time and cost, but it's not only regulation. But FDA just a week or so ago came out with a new horizon scanning exercise by the new commissioner, Scott Gottlieb. And he wants to introduce much more competition. Mm-hmm. He thinks that the pricing of technologies has been unbalanced largely because the problems of generic or specialty drugs where there's only one branded drug, no one else chooses to enter the market because it's for a narrow population of patients, and without a competitor, then the freedom to raise prices is almost unbounded. So Gottlieb's proposal is to use the policies available to the FDA and maybe more broadly to increase even more competition. And he thinks that over time this would lead to a substantial reduction in runaway prices. And,
I'm aware of that, and I actually support most of the things that have been said. And Secretary Assar made some comments. I think everyone was expecting some comments from President Trump. From what I understand, they may be delayed. I don't know that for sure, but they may be delayed. But there's a few things there that I think everyone, no matter where you stand, has to agree on this. We should accelerate the transition to generics, and that's part of the natural life cycle of a drug. So I definitely support that. I think the idea of enhancing competition, just that we see that in every other realm of our economy. The idea of, I think very importantly, of protecting patients from the process. I think we can go behind closed doors and fight ferocious fights on how we get prices down, but patients should not be put in the middle. So I think one of the things that could be done is remove this whole notion of consumerism pressure. What I mean by that, if patients are capped on how much they have to pay in a copay, I think they're taken off from the equation. I've always said I'm surprised that no bioethicists are calling out that action that puts someone who's a vulnerable individual with a diagnosis of cancer now having to make decisions. Should I pay this drug, or maybe should I leave a little bit of extra money for my wife? I think the whole idea of the social construct of insurance is to remove that pressure. Yes. And I think that's particularly true for Medicare patients who have to pay large copays. And then, the idea of looking at intermediaries, there's a lot of discussion about the PBMs. I think that was one of the points you were making with the comments from the commissioners. Where is their value and where there's not? Let's just, get rid of that. Now, I do worry, and I've seen proposals. I've gotten quite a bit involved with the whole thing with price of drugs. When people think about, we can just take away those patents, marching on the rights, the so-called eminent domain. I think that's terrible. I mean, obviously that would stop innovation on its feet. The same is true for compulsory licensing. There's this notion of formularies and even Medicare negotiation, which I think at the end of the day, what we really are talking about price fixing or formularies that exclude certain drugs, which at the end of the day, it's obviously not what we want for patients, but there's clearly a lot of dialogue going on this topic.
Well, one of the topics that Gottlieb has made public recently is the potential to revisit the exemptions of safe harbors for kickbacks.
Mm-hmm.
So both the GPO industry and the PBM industry have received what, to any reasonable mind, are kickbacks from manufacturers. So those safe harbors, those exemptions were created to protect that system, but Gottlieb and others now are saying maybe this needs to be re-examined.
Sure.
And maybe those exemptions should be discontinued. The system has gotten so complicated, and some transparency is almost certainly needed for patients and their families and providers to much better understand going into a care episode who's going to be on the hook for the payment, for how much and over what period of time. When patients have a procedure done, even simple procedures, and they get a bill 2 weeks later for a portion of it, and then a month later for another portion.
And he says that this is not a bill.
And this is
right. the proverbial, this is not a bill.
There's something about this that just doesn't sit well with society at large, patients in particular. And I think somehow we're going to have to simplify both the understanding of how all these complicated processes work, but then also the process itself.
Yeah, especially when we live in a world when you can buy a ticket to Budapest with a stopover in London and you can choose your seat and you can compare prices, right? And how does that sit with people who need access to more important things like healthcare and medicine and just don't have the tools to do that?
Yeah, that's right. It's always going to be expensive. I think if you want to have a system with as much quality and as much capacity and functionality as our healthcare system, we treat tens of millions of patients a year. We achieve just phenomenally good outcomes in the majority. We're making progress at a very respectable rate. And those are not things you can accomplish for $5. So if we're going to have a carefully regulated, intensely scientific, deeply vetted system, then we're simply going to have to live with the idea that it's costly, just the way automobiles are costly and homes are costly. And then the question becomes, what's the equitable way to spread those costs, to share those so that there's fair value achieved and that those that participate are in it for their fair share.
Sure. And just to put in a plug for innovation, I think we should not stop because those costs obviously will fall with time. I mean, we saw this with HIV/AIDS. When I was in training, a third of our admissions to the hospital were AIDS-related complications.
Yeah.
So much so that we actually went into the creation of buildings just so we could house those patients. Now, of course, everyone who thinks about that realizes that many of these patients have a near normal life expectancy.
Yes, that's right.
I just had the opportunity to give one talk that describes this idea of the future of medicine, and I said, well, I want to look back at today and maybe do so in 20 years and say, can you believe those humans in 2018, they had cancer centers? How primitive. And it's not far-fetched because we look back and we had tuberculosis sanatoriums in the past.
Yes.
And that, is not a problem anymore. Of course, there's huge challenges ahead of us, aging, Alzheimer's, neural disorders in general, which we still need to tackle, but we clearly are not there.
Well, we can think of so many procedures today that have become routine and are associated with extremely good outcomes, but we don't have to look back too far. Early 1960s, Christian Barnard performed a first heart transplant, miserable failure. The patient died almost immediately. His cases were followed by Cooley, who ostensibly stole DeBakey's heart out of the lab when DeBakey was traveling in Europe, implanted it prematurely in a patient. That patient also rapidly expired. And the failures were so profound that society said maybe we should disinvest from work on organ transplantation, or artificial organs. And if we hadn't continued to fund the NIH that put money into the research and a lot of manufacturers to build prototype devices and go through trials, we wouldn't have lived to the era of even blood typing that Shumway pioneered at Stanford decades after Barnard's first transplant. Mm-hmm. And then later with 5FU, and then after that cyclosporin, which opened whole new opportunities for solid organ transplant. And today, for many patient groups, a kidney transplant, if the organ is properly matched, your life expectancy is only something like 5 years less than if you hadn't had the illness to begin with.
That's just incredible.
It's amazing.
Absolutely. I know we can do this for a very, very long time, but I want to come, to some closure, and we probably should do this again. And I know we're going to have dinner afterwards, so I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah.
But do you want to share some story about Cook? And you and I have talked about some of them before, and I just find it remarkable. The third company, finally comes up, and there's all these products that help patients, and there are other stories about Cook that you would like to share if there's.
Well, it's still a family-owned business. It's privately held, and I think that has afforded the company certain luxuries. What Bill used to say, not serving two masters, the physician customer and the shareholder. He always believed you can only serve one master. And he didn't want his decisions diluted by shareholders when he was working hard to satisfy the needs of the physician. So 55 years in, we've learned a lot of lessons. There are concerns today. There's both in the drug world and in devices, there's enormous consolidation. The bigger players get bigger and bigger, and there's the M&A activity, the mergers and acquisitions are unabated. It's getting very hard now for the small startup to compete for markets with these dominant multinationals that have so much supply chain power that even with better products, getting a hospital to buy off contract for a device with a specialty indication that may perform better than anything out there, but because they don't have the market power of a large publicly traded company or even large private companies, their ability to compete is hampered. And I hope that our system will find ways to enable small, medium, and large corporations to exist in this very healthy ecosystem of trade-offs and balances and capabilities and novelty. But a concerning trend that I see is that so much market power is drifting toward fewer and fewer, larger and larger players. I think we're down to less than 100 pharmaceutical companies in the United States. In the device world, we have over 5,000, most of them very small players. But in the last 10 years, there have been just acquisitions at a scale that would have been unimaginable 20 years ago. And while some of that I think is quite healthy, if taken to an extreme, could deprive our markets of some of the most exciting technologies that haven't even been invented yet. I hope that, and you touched on it, Raphael, the ability for producers and consumers of technology, the physicians that conceive and test technologies that then transfer into the manufacturers that produce these to standards, ensure consistency, reliability, have deeply embedded quality standards. If these parties are not encouraged to work closely together, it's hard to imagine our system being as productive in the future. This intimate association between those that really understand the problem at the patient interface, a special privilege that none of us in manufacturing will ever comprehend, nor should we attempt to. But when we take our talents in engineering, and regulatory science, and quality control, and ensure that the production of those products imagined by the clinical inventor, that relationship between the manufacturer and the clinician is a very special one, and I hope we'll preserve it. I'm also worried that what we call conflicts has become a firewall from a policy standpoint in many, many institutions. That is, an inventor who has invented really to help their own patients, and in some way you could say help their own practice, is now being divorced from their own technology because there may be some interest that exists, even when the vast majority of companies today shield that entire institution from the royalty payments to avoid any perception of conflict. So it's not only common, it's sort of the dominant standard today for manufacturers to not just shield a hospital, but a whole health system where that inventor may be admitting patients or whether their colleagues or subordinates could be taking care of patients and influenced by this inventor. And even with these safeguards in place, for some reason our system is bent on isolating inventors from their discoveries and prohibiting them from treating the patients in the way that they really set out to do in the first place. And I think if they become savvy to this, they realize that their hospital isn't going to adopt their technology once it's on the market, if it gets that far.
Sure.
Not an easy thing today. Many will say, if I can't help my patient with my invention, I'm not doing this for people in Germany.
Sure.
Or people on the other coast. I'm really doing this to help my own patient.
Maybe I'm too much of an optimist, but I hold dearly the belief that most of these things start because someone wants to do something for their patient.
Yes.
And they really see the opportunity and they pursue excellence. And then, yeah, sure enough, fortune may follow. If we would all be so fortunate, that's a rarity. Most products don't make it to the market, but everyone starts with that notion that I want to do what's best for my patients. And most of the concern is because of the potential, not because of the real, not because of the, ever present, but the potential conflict, which is really problematic because then you create this divorce.
Well, and another question we'll have to ask is, do we object to other incentives that are associated with inventing? If this person happens to write a paper
Sure.
and they develop some fame, do we resent that fame to such a degree that we don't want them involved with their own technology?
Sure.
Or maybe they're invited to speak at an important scientific meeting and now they have celebrity. Is that so objectionable and so offensive that we say, okay, you cannot be the person to present on your own technology?
Absolutely. You go to Retraction Watch, the most common things are postdocs who want to advance in their career. I mean,
Yeah.
that's true for the Office of Research Integrity as well at the NIH. So I think there's a lot more to the story than we're usually sold with sort of the common narrative.
It certainly goes beyond just the money, but
Mhm.
there are other benefits to inventing, practice building, celebrity, recognition, scientific achievement, and they all contribute to good reasons to work on those projects. But as soon as we treat those as criminal activities,
Of course, and the suspect and morally dubious. That's a problem. That's definitely a problem.
yeah.
Bruce, I want to thank you. You're the first guest in this conversations we have. So you were a gracious pioneer. We hope the quality of everything is as we expect it to be. But certainly, there's still so much more we can talk about. We talked about journals. We talked about quality. We just barely touched on conflicts. But I hope we can do this again.
Well, thank you for all those challenging questions. And unfortunately, there's not easy answers to any of them. But thank you for having me. And I hope there'll be many more guests with you in the future.